Hey.
Oh, Javier, would you call a life update? I call a philosophical bombshell going off. So tell me about your life update. That's a heck of a life update. And Dimitri and Chetan. Dimitri has a heck of a background with the cigarette and everything. That is hot. So tell me about your life. Chetan. So tell me about your life update and philosophy and dominating and making people feel inadequate, because I think that's all really important.
Um, so yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. My life update ended up being like a philosophical kind of discourse because
Well, what
as you
else
know,
is a life update but an update on philosophical discourse,
yeah,
right? I mean, the movement of the concept. Yeah, discourse, exactly.
the one problem I've noticed is like I like for example, when we discuss here, I don't see these problems as prevalent or as like exaggerated, you could say. Um, but what I notice is that when I'm talking to like someone that I'm interested in and vice versa, um, it's difficult to navigate that discourse without them feeling some type of way in terms of like feeling inadequate, feeling like you are pushing some type of proposition on them. Um, and it does get a little, I can see why it gets confusing because you don't want it to become a debate. You want it to be a discussion. But if the other feels already inadequate in that power dynamic, then in some sense they perceive it as a debate. Like they have to give some type of response and they don't have that response. And so they start to feel offended, insecure. But I think that was the main point that I was trying to get at is that like I can't like convince them of this position that actually I am also inadequate. I am also lacking. Like there is no power dynamic in this, but I think it is there is a power dynamic, obviously, but it's because I don't even know how to say it. Like I was just thinking about this morning about power dynamic because I think power is a way to cover over the gap of the lack.
Yeah.
So I fundamentally feel like that's what it is. Like, oh yeah, I don't have the knowledge. I feel inadequate. So obviously there's this unfair power dynamic, right? But if we both understand that we lack, then to me there is no, you could say, power dynamic in that sense. But it's
And
because
we can
power.
also,
Yeah, go ahead, Dimitri.
sorry to interrupt,
Go ahead.
but I have to say this because yeah, uh, this all can also be the opposite. It can also be that that it's like that lack obfuscates a power dynamic. Not only the power dynamic obfuscates a lack, but also the lack obfuscates a power dynamic.
Well,
And it was of all people, Judith Butler, who was really having a like hysterical attack at this for good reasons, because we support hysteria over here. She said that basically what happened is that all these men are like, yeah, we are not a patriarchy anymore. We are now like all castrated and we are so neutered. We don't even have testosterone in our ball sacks anymore. We are equal to women. And then she's like saying that no, it's like accept that you're in the position of the master, accept this. And like because this is like like if you imagine, I mean, I can't imagine like how horrible it would be if you are a woman and then your boyfriend is like, yes, oh my god, we are so equal, it's so nice, and then you're like, no, like
yes.
fuck man, step up your game.
No, no, this is a good point because I think there's a way that we can say that power can manipulate itself as a perceived lack. Like, oh yes, we're so blah blah blah, but that's an effacement already, in my opinion. But I think because towards the end of my update, I said that I cannot convince the other that this is true, that we're equal. That's what I ended with because I was ultimately pessimistic about this because I was like, I don't think I can even convince the other that this is true, that actually we both lack, that we're on the same level. And so that's where I was like laughing because I was like, I mean, I understand that really the power covers it over, but also at the same time, I can't tell them that we're equal because they don't believe it.
Well, what about you know what I think?
Go ahead.
What about like punching yourself verbally? It's like usually that's the best way. It's like, you know, if you show like, hey, I'm just lacking, you know, then it's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, you're not like trying to get it in on me. And actually, I had this experience a while ago. I thought I met someone who's like just so arrogant and he's such a horrible person. But then suddenly he started making this masochist little joke, and I was like, "Oh, you're also you're not all that." And then we became great friends. But I always have this. That's just a side note. I always like if I don't like you, like spontaneously when we just met, that's probably a good sign, and that's probably means that we're gonna be friends later on. It keeps reoccurring with me. I cannot do anything about it.
I mean, I will admit that I tried to remedy the situation by saying, like, look, I was like, you'll be surprised that I am a smart and stupid man at the same time. And she started laughing because look, I live with two other people. They're not intimidated by me. There's a reason why they're not intimidated by me. Okay. Like they have an encounter with me that they know that there is nothing to be that the power dynamic is false essentially, but I cannot say that explicitly, and I think that's the interesting point. I think what we're talking about with like words, like you can't just say like, yeah, we're equal, because that just doesn't. I'm gonna leave it there because I know people got stuff to say.
Well, I'll give it to Cheetan first. Dimitri, I suck. I suck so much. I truly suck. So in second, wow, I really love Javier's love life. And I really love working on his love language because it's amazing. A few things I would say. Second, I think there's a lot of very interesting things here. So in my experience, actually people like, they'll actually make a point to say, I don't do philosophy and it's all abstract to me and I'm just a simple person. And that's actually a power move. Because what they're saying is that philosophy is a waste of time. And that's actually the predominant experience I have. Also, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of philosophers can't get jobs. They are not acknowledged by the society. They are not valued. And in fact, when they go to try to like fix a pipe or do something practical, they feel really inadequate. So what's important to realize is that the discussion might be one of the few places where the philosopher is not inadequate, but the majority of their life can be a constant feeling of, wow, I don't get paid for what I do, and it is inadequate. And so what's going on here? And the other thing I'll say that I think is important is in the same way that we've talked a lot about the abyssal nature of philosophy and choice and different things. The problem is that the metrics are also abyssal. Like the metrics by which you gauge philosophical concepts like right, wrong, true, false, these themselves seem to be kind of abyssal. So there's a bunch of problems here that are going on. But you see, you have to ask the following question. Are some things true and some things false? And if you say yes, well, then automatically then we're operating with some sort of hierarchy that's not a personal hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy given by what? Determination. So for example, if I'm trying to fix a pipe under the house, then if I suck at it, it's not a matter of debate. It's because everything is like flooding now, right? It's given by the world. It's not like a hierarchy, like the world does the power move, right? The determinations of the world do the power move. It's not really the people. When it comes to a pipe or a football game, it's easy to see that. The situation, it's not like the guy who wins the game, you just don't go, oh, he's an arrogant prick who thinks he's better than everyone. It's just a fact. He won the game, right? He's better. No one, it's not like a personal thing. It's literally the construct of football suggests that he is the better player, right? Likewise, if the pipe breaks, it literally means Fred is better at making pipes than Daniel because the pipe broke. The issue is that the metric or the game, if we use Wittgenstein language, of philosophy is not self-evident. It does not give itself to you. So you kind of have to do philosophy to know the game of philosophy to then judge what is better philosophy or not. Well, then if people don't do philosophy, they can't even determine the game to judge what's better or not. So they just think you're an arrogant prick, right? Like it's not given. This is the issue. Like philosophy is abyssal all the way down, right? It's abyssal all the way down. So then the question is, what are we doing, right? Well, I think the question then is, do we benefit from philosophy or not? And then that would be the question of, is there better, like we said last time, are there better decisions or not? Are there better horizons or not? And can your horizon of experience change? This is very important. Sometimes I do think it can be a problem to simply frame like, is life have meaning or life doesn't have meaning? These kind of macro things. You would say, well, it's a matter of opinion. Well, let me ask you this. I say, your wife's cheating on you. oh, that is a different horizon of experience. Or if I were to say to you, you have cancer, you are impoverished. Do we really want to say there isn't better horizons or worse horizons now? Like, because if I say you have cancer, it's not like I've added something to reality. It might be something you've had for months. I've changed your interpretational lens, right? And you can practically experience horizontal shifts, right? That are not equal, right? But the horizon is not given in facticity, is the lens by which you see facticity or determinations. Are there better lenses or not? Are there lenses that make you less susceptible to fascism, totalitarianism, control, power, or not? And if you say there are, then this utterly abyssal game all the way down is something you have to play, because there are consequences if you don't play. But the problem is that you have to do philosophy to even see the game. So then it seems like there is no game. So there's this kind of total self-relation that's kind of going on that makes this very, very tricky. But really, I just want to point out, we would never use the logic of it's all equal when it comes to playing football or fixing pipes, and I would also stress that philosophers spend a lot of time feeling like they do something that's irrelevant because they can't get paid for it unless they join a system. And then if they're in the university, they're in meetings all the time. So there's things that have to be considered. But anyway, I think what you're getting at in your life, love life, is there the same thing at this point? Update was lovely. So let me give it to Cheetan. Cheetan, it is so good to see you.
It's wonderful to be here. Am I audible? I'm not with my laptop today, actually. I'm on my iPad. I don't have my laptop. It's fine, huh? Yeah. I love these games with the big other, actually. You know, these are wonderful moments when you encounter the problem of the big other in that sense. I remember when I was young, in my engineering days, very young, maybe a decade back or something, I went on a date with a girl, not exactly a date. And I pretended to be, I used to play sports in the basketball team in school and college and so on and so forth. And I met her in that role of a sports person who doesn't read, who doesn't study, who doesn't, and it was an experience, and I didn't realize it. I was giving a certain kind of jouissance to her. She was really enjoying meeting somebody with whom she had a claim on knowledge. And once the meeting went on, then months on, we used to meet on internet once in a while. And I didn't realize it, some months later, she realized that I was just playing a role in that sense. It wasn't that I am not read or, so she saw my Facebook post or something like that. And her complete interest in me got lost. It was like one time, snap. So it's extremely interesting how power dynamic in these situations actually play out. Because eventually we have to understand that I think big other is getting invoked, whether we like it or not, with philosophy. Once you are becoming the center of some kind of rules, whatever those rules might be, as you said, any game requires certain rules, and those rules need to be embodied at some point, at some place. Even if the big other is completely lacking, yet the rules will be embodied somewhere, and there is a struggle where the rules will be embodied. That struggle can't be escaped. And no matter how much you let go of the embodiment of the rules, once that turn comes to you, once you have to play that role, you have to be honest about it, that you are playing that role at whatever level you can be, and which is what I think Dimitri's point about, you have to take the place of the master if that is the place that is given to you in that role. And if somebody else wants to take that role of the big other, please go ahead, be my guest. I'm more than happy to do it. I don't mind it, as long as you're okay discussing and opening up your lack with me. So if I'm playing that role, I have to be okay opening up my lack to you. And if you are playing that role, you have to be okay, with my questions, my doubts, my hysterical subjectivity vis-a-vis your, lack in that sense. And it's extremely interesting. I'll just sort of maybe say one more thing and I'll stop there. On this question of power, it's one of the research questions that I had very early on when I started researching, maybe in my earlier days in that sense. One of my first research problems was power. And power is an extremely interesting thing. And Hannah Arendt gets it. Power is not simply something that divides us. Power actually exists in something where you can act in concert, when your action actually can represent the action of other people in that sense. So if I can act in a way in which you all are implicated, I'm acting on your behalf, I'm taking that my action is just not my action. It's something we collectively share immediately. That's power. That's real power, as Hannah Arendt would say it. And of course, Foucauldian power and Hannah Arendt power are different conceptions, and we can get into the technicality of that problem. That for Arendt, power and violence are opposite things. So Hannah Arendt says, actually, you engage with violence where you fall short with power. When I can't actually, my actions, my thinking cannot represent you. We can't act in concert. There, I would need to use violence to actually supplement that gap. For Foucault, power and violence actually can find a continuity with each other. How do we think through of power differently than simply this idea of power which divides us? Power which can, in some senses, where, as Arendt's term, I'm borrowing, to act in concert. We can act in some kind of, what is it about that position that we, maybe we can discuss that. Yeah.
I think it's magnificent. I'll give to Javier. For me, so first off, I think it's absolutely the case that there's some power that cannot be escaped, and it seems to be inevitable. However, when I have a broken toilet and I don't know how to fix it, I want to find someone who has power over me in the sense of the ability to fix the toilet. In fact, not being able to find someone who has that power, because in that situation, they have power over me because they can fix it and I can't, it would be devastating, right? And actually, when I encounter someone in a situation who's capable of doing something I cannot, then that's almost my step in the dance where I need to be humble and let them step in. If the person shows up and I'm like, no, I don't need you. I don't need you. I'm trying to take power back. And that's actually the wrong thing. So there's some kind of dance. It seems to me that the problem is hierarchy without distribution or decentralization and singular hierarchies. Like, for example, you want a society that has arguably millions of hierarchies, someone who's good at the cars, someone who's good at the toilet, somebody that's good with family, somebody that's good at guarding, and then equal access of people to those different skill sets. The problem is that when it comes to government power, it's by definition a monopoly on violence. And that's where you get all this issue. And there's some sort of limitation of decentralization. So governmental power has this great problem that's then coming up with the Web 3.0, because it's like, how do we decentralize and distribute government hierarchy, which would be the hierarchy of governance. But when it comes to hierarchies, say, of fixing cars or maybe insight into relationships, then that's where the question is, okay, is there someone who, say, can fix cars in Alta Vista, Rustburg, Lynchburg for everyone to access at a rate that people can afford to take care of their situations? And that access to those different hierarchies in that decentralized way is what you would need to have a functioning society, because it's literally, because of the very practical facticity of reality, impossible to have everyone know everything. You can't be an expert engineer and doctor and nuclear physicist and philosopher and so on and so forth, right? So there's something here about power, like hierarchy, which I would associate with power in this context, many hierarchies, distribution, decentralization that all have to go together. And if they don't go together, then you get all sorts of problems. And the question is the following: is philosophy a kind of skill that actually is similar to the ability to, say, fix a toilet, that deals with abyssal situations that people's lives are directly impacted by? I can say that one of the reasons I got interested in philosophy is precisely seeing so many people's lives get kind of tangled up in problems that they didn't even have the eyes to see. Kind of like the repetition in psychoanalysis you can't get out of, right? So you're like, oh my gosh, life is a thing where you can end up in problems that you may not even be able to see as problems. It's like crazy. So how do I avoid that? Because by definition, if I end up in one of those, I won't even know I've ended up in one of those. That means a perpetual sort of meta skill, meta analysis, right? As like I've said before, like with laymen, like no one gets married planning to get a divorce. Well, how do they get a divorce then? No one's planning it. No one plans to live a bad life. No one plans to be stupid, right? And yet, by definition, these things happen. So how do they if no one intends them, right? Well, there has to be some sort of abyssal structure in operation that you have to keep your eye on. That's invisible. So how do you keep your eye on it? So there's some sort of constant tearing there. Anyway, let me give it to Javier and then Dimitri. Javier.
Yeah, I mean, I view the philosopher like the garbage man, like, what do we do with all this waste? Because, I mean, fundamentally, that is kind of what we have to pay attention to when we talk about even pragmatic solutions, structural solutions. I mean, nobody is paying attention to the sort of waste that gets created when you decide to bring up a structure or criteria for action or a choice. There is a kind of waste. You can even say ideological waste that is not even paid attention to when someone is doing something. The other thing that I want to bring up is I think I want to complicate the power dynamic in two ways in terms of subject of loss and subject of lack. Because I think if you perceive yourself as a subject of loss, then I think this is how we function primarily through power dynamic. That the other has lost power, the other one has it, so I am a subject of loss. But what I'm trying to get at is that I want people to see that fundamentally the power itself is only a kind of concerting thing, like Chitan is saying, because we are subjects of lack. I have to represent, when I teach a subject, I have to represent the knowledge, and so I have, in some sense, the power. But the thing with that is that my power is not my power. And I think that's what people don't get. It's like, because the moment you say it's my power, what you're saying is you are a subject of loss, not a subject of lack. And if you start thinking in that term of like, yeah, I've lost power, I've gained power, you are again the subject of loss. And what I want to get at is, how can we, and I don't know if we should be proposing solutions, but I do think there is a kind of dialectic within the subject of loss that allows you to understand that actually I'm a subject of lack, and that this power dynamic thing isn't necessarily something that we have. It's something that we have to represent because we are subjects of lack, right? There's somebody that has to fix the car. You have to represent the mechanic. You're the doctor. You have to represent somebody that fixes diseases and ailments and something. So it's not that it's actually my power. And I wonder, I'd be curious to see what you guys think in terms of that dialectic of subject of loss and subject of lack, because I think that is crucial. And I think if we stay in the subject of loss, I think that is exactly what Chitan would be pointing at to, where we have to commit violence. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's I'll leave that open.
Well, I'll give it to Dimitri. Everything you put your finger on is very important. So there's this issue, like when the guy comes to fix your car, his power over me is not just him to me, it's him to car to me. And so it doesn't feel like it's from him, right? So this is where philosophers are like, it's not me, it's capital T truth, right? And this is where like Foucault and all them's like, hey, dude, there isn't. So then it's just power. That's why the postmodern critique is a big deal. Because then you can, as a philosopher, say that you're just ascribing to the truth. It's not you, right? So that debate's very big. And this is where Richard Rorty and the neo-pragmatists come along and say there is no capital T truth or whatever. There's just pragmatism. And if philosophy is stuck to pragmatism, then it can't be a power dynamic. Well, this is where I get obsessed with phenomenological pragmatism, because here's the problem. Horizons of interpretation are pragmatic as well, but cannot be located or tested by mere determination, right? Psychoanalysis is in fact practical because it impacts how you interpret the world. But the moment you say there are different interpretations of which then make things towards you in different manners that organize your practice, then it will not do to simply have a neo-pragmatic Richard Rorty understanding of the role of philosophy. You then have to get into the meta and the abstract. Well, guess what? Once you do that, then you are talking about something that's external to you, but not reducible to you. And this gets into all the meta-modern emergent Hegel and all that. Like, that's why it's a big deal, because what you're saying is, sure, maybe capital T truth is unknowable, maybe no one can have a monopoly on it, but something like that, something meta, is at play that is not reducible to me that I'm speaking to. But guess what? While you can see the car that the mechanic is getting their authority from, and therefore it's not personal, you cannot see the meta structure that the philosophy is referring to, so you think they're just being an a-hole, right? That's the problem. I can see the determination of the car that is the judge saying, I don't have power here, and the mechanic does. And then it also feels fair. It doesn't feel like dominance. It just feels like the power that is reality. Whereas meta structures are invisible, so it's easy to think that it's just the philosopher having power. And then you're like, well, you're just a dick, dude. Just stop it. And that's the issue. And this is where This is where belonging again is correct in the sense that we're now in a world without givens, and we have to create and choose absolutely our own background to make intelligibility possible. We have an issue because that by definition requires people to understand the metastructure at scale. It's all the problem of scale again. And if people can't do that, well, we've got an issue. We're now just stuck then in endless cycles of falling into fascism on one side, nihilism on the other, totalitarian. All like to move from the explanation of belonging again to the address of belonging again, you have to have a collective ability to refer to metastructure as being as authoritative as the engine of a car. And what the heck does that look like? Because another way to put that would be a movement from subject of loss to subject of lack. Here's the problem. The nature of scale is as you move, like it's easier to get subjects of lack on a small scale. As you move to a large scale, it tends to be lost because it feels like you're losing in the large scale. So this is all the problem of scale again. But I think anyway, let me give it to Dimitri and Titan.
Okay, so Daniel, what brings you were talking about what brings one to philosophy. Now, Mr. Hegel, he has this book called The Philosophy of History. He also has the History of Philosophy. It's a mess. But he says that I don't even know in which one he said this, but it's in one of those two books. It doesn't really matter. He says, it's not like anyone's gonna read it by me saying it anyway. Anyway, you should read those books. They're really good. But basically, like anytime that Hegel says, like, oh, this is really some great philosophy that was produced, it's in moments of historical crises. So, for example, Neoplatonism and the Roman Empire, for example, Plato and Aristotle at the end of the Greek civilization. And I mean, it's true for my own life, too. It's like I wouldn't have gone to philosophy if I didn't go through some crazy crises. And I mean, the fact that I stuck to it and went all the way to where I'm up now, not that it's like amazing, but it's like it says something. For sure. And what's actually funny is just a side note. Hegel actually says the same about art. That really great art emerges in crises as well. For example, comedy, and he talks about Aristophanes and also, of course, the famous Greek tragedy. He says that this kind of art was, like especially take something like Antigone. Hegel's basic analysis. I mean, you don't have to agree with it, but it's a famous piece. Hegel's analysis is that, like in tragedy, there's two goods which are opposed. And then Antigone actually had the two substances of the familial law and the state law in herself manifested, and she could not act right. Like the one way that she would act right was like the way that she would act wrong. So you could see like the mutual incompatibility of the family and the state law. Now, this revelation of Antigone as a tragedy actually laid bare to the fall of Greek civilization for Hegel, which gave like the problem there is super interesting. Actually, the problem there was like there was no Greek civilization didn't account for free subjectivity. So eventually this was sublated, and then we get like the abstract person of the law in Roman Empire. Anyway, you can read the Phenomenology of Spirit. He talks about it there too. Yeah, this whole subject of loss thing. I was there when Dr. McGowan was talking about this kind of stuff, and I mean, look, I think probably it has some pedagogical function. Actually, I'm really struggling with this philosophically myself, but like, usually I'm kind of depressed. I really love being alone, but eventually when I'm alone too much, I get too depressed, and then I have to self-repel and talk to friends or something like this. Then also with friends and family or whoever I'm talking to, it gets annoying, the persistence of the fact that you know, that they are there. So then I have to repel from that again and then be alone. And then I get depressed again. But I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't want to seem like narcissistic about this, but I'm just like, I'm just usually just so depressed. So I'm a subject of loss. And I really vouch for this, you know. I'm gonna speak for the devil. I'm a subject of loss. I don't think we should be ashamed of this. So I mean, I'm also a subject of lack. Of course, I'm castrated. You know, I'm not gonna pretend I'm not. But you know, I'm recently, after a year, I think, of, oh no, actually, left a few months of not publishing anything. I'm writing a new article now because apparently you're watching The Net by OG Rose. Now I will give you a sneak peek, and the title is called "The Eye as a Funny Circle." So basically, I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna spoil some things. Now, for Hegel, the eye is a funny circle. Why? Because, you know, I, as a subject, let's say I do this, decide to think the I, but then immediately it turns out that this I that I want to think is not me, it's an object. You know, like I want to think the I. Then we have the subject I, and we have the predicate or the object of thought, which is the I. Now, these are two different I's. The first I is the I, the singular me, you know, with all my facial features and whatever. And then the second I, which I want to think, well, I'm not really denoting myself with that. I'm denoting the I as such. And this is not me. This is not me, the I. This is also not you, as in, you know, Javier as the I. This is like neither me nor Javier, nor Daniel, nor Chetan. This is the universal I. So it seems like at the moment I want to think the I, there's suddenly two I's. You know, it falls apart. It seems very sad. But you know, what do we do about this? Well, we need not fret, because Hegel comes and saves the day. He told me the other day, by me hallucinating him speaking when I was reading the Science of Logic, that actually what's happening here is that, well, this does show a truth of the I, but it shows only that the truth of the I is the fact that it is simultaneously the subject and the object. Or in other words, the I is simultaneously singular, as in, you know, me, and universal as such. Now, I'm gonna make an argument that Kant's epistemology or Kant's implicit metaphysics couldn't grasp or comprehend the humoristic and like spiritual and like comedic element taking place in the I and its quirky circle. We're all quirky circles anyway. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to say, but not without reason, because when I was writing this article, I'm like, damn, like it's so hard to write simply what I want to communicate. And because I could like write it simply and like kind of like basically make a transcript of what I've just said, but then I don't, you know, then I don't, it doesn't feel right with me. It doesn't feel right with me. So, you know, what's absolute knowing? A few days ago, I was at the airport and my flight was at 6 o'clock. It was really horrible. And then I was with another guy. It was, we were like sitting there at 5 o'clock, and then this guy's a bit interested in philosophy. So he was asking me, what's absolute knowing? You know, what's this thing Hegel talks about? And I was in a super bad mood. So I said, you know, it's meaningless. It's nothing. It's just insubstantial. It's bullshit. Don't listen to it. And I mean, I was definitely in a bad mood, and it influenced my answer. But like absolute knowing is, I believe, truly like insubstantial. You know, it's like if it's anything, it's some kind of negative unity where you like absolute knowing. There's nothing new there. You just look back on everything that's taken place in the present, right? In the present, right? Now, Hegel is actually mega humble. He's maybe the most humble philosopher that's ever existed, because, you know, even though they say, oh yes, he talks about the meta level of the truth with, you know, it capitalized T, which is like the size of a skyscraper. But no, it's not like this, you know. It's okay, maybe it is like this for the present, but we cannot say anything about the future. And this is huge, you know. like all we want to know about is the future. That's why that's why what I want to know about, what's gonna happen in the future, what's gonna happen with me. That's what usually our kind of anxiety in this anticipation is directed at, like, okay, I can basically still hold on, but if in the future something goes wrong, like we want to know about the future. And there was this wonderful talk that Zizek had with Will Self, this writer. He writes fiction. It was a hilarious talk, highly recommended. At a certain point, Will Self is getting so frustrated. He keeps like trying to whip Zizek, and then Zizek just keeps giving him, like, I mean, you guys know how Zizek is. He doesn't really give you a definitive answer, so you can know what you can do with your own life. So Will Self at a certain point was like, I'm sick and tired of you. You are a philosopher. You have to tell me what to do. You have to instruct me what to do with my life. And then Zizek was like, I mean, it wasn't really an amazing response, but he basically said, no, this is not the case. And I think that's fantastic, and like all philosophy can do, and this comes back to what you said, Daniel, about a decision making. All philosophy can do is set us up to make a decision. Now, of course, this decision then has to be its own grounding, and everything fails again. The whole castle crumbles, so we come to philosophy again. But yeah, this is super interesting to me. And like, okay, just to finalize it, I know I'm talking a lot, but I actually have something to say. This is why. If we go to philosophy because of crises, and philosophy cannot say anything about the future, which is all we want to know about when we go through a crisis, then, what does philosophy really do? Well, and this is not me saying anything new, because I don't think I've ever said anything new. But for Hegel, it's basically absolute spirit, or just like, the subject working through its own history. Now, something here, and I'm always trying to critique Hegel. Usually I fail at it. I don't know. Maybe I'm gonna succeed at it at some point. But like, what Hegel is doing is like, the way Hegel reads his own imperative, if we're gonna call it that spirit has to work through its own history to reconcile with the present, so it can be set up for, so it can have this clearing to make a decision for the future. Well, why do you then write about like the Persian Empire and all this kind of stuff? Like, you never experienced that stuff, and like, I mean, there's certainly something to be said to study deep history as such. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's definitely some psychological presuppositions that Hegel has in the Science of Logic as to why he would write the Science of Logic. Now, this is, I think, we get a different view on this with psychoanalysis and the question of jouissance, which Hegel couldn't conceptualize. But yeah, I digress. But because I've said what I needed to say.
Well, thank you, Dimitri and Mr. Fishman and Michelle. Good to see you. And first off, I love the idea of Hegel at the airport. How to end up never reading Hegel. That's great. Second, I love the idea of philosophy starting with crisis, because we really, really are indebted to Javier's love life crises, because those like, if Hegel was alive now, he'd be like, Javier's romance life is the center of history. That's where the Geist is coming forth. So we're very grateful for Javier. Second, I think what's interesting, and then I'll give it, there's a few things, like, one of the things you could say that philosophy does, like, if you say, oh, it's all abyssal, well, then maybe when you have Thanksgiving dinner and politics comes up, you won't never talk to your uncle again, right? Like, that's kind of beneficial, because a lot of people who have no philosophical training, when like disagreements come up, they're like personal and they never talk to one another. And if you can avoid that, that seems to be good, right? So there's, that mediation of instinct stuff. It should also be noted that traditionally philosophy is associated with doctor, pharmaceutical. If the doctor says, hey, you're obese and you need to run, that's not the doctor actually like forcing you to, right? He's just telling you, hey, buddy, you may want to do this. You still have to make the choice to do it, right? So you can say the doctor has power in that situation, But in another way, he doesn't, because he's totally helpless to make you not obese. It's completely up to you to then put it into practice. And there might be something there as well involving like philosophical insight, especially when we're talking like skills and action. The other thing too is, I think, like when we kind of talk about loss versus lack subject, I think what I would say is I think there's truth to the idea that there is no solutions, but we have to be careful not to think that means there are no better ways to manage situations. Like there is something about there is no ultimate solution, right? Like if you're a loss and you want an object, you get the object and you still have the loss because you're ontologically a lack. Well, that's all perfectly fine if you know that, so then you're not totally devastated and can move on to another loss, right? The issue is that if you don't have categorical distinctions about loss somehow having a participation in some ontological lack, then it can be devastating, or you can always externalize your solutions and you never engage in a management structure. And that's where it seems to me one of the issues is to somehow talk about the abyssal nature of philosophy and the fact that there are no solutions without making it sound like it doesn't make a difference. Because there's always a danger in a kind of nihilistic attitude, or where you say, oh, it's too negative, or we need to be more negative, which of course in an overly optimistic world, that's kind of what you can need. But there can also be a, well, it doesn't matter, like everyone's equal. There's actually behind nihilism can be a kind of equality. Like everything is equal, however you live your life, it doesn't really matter, or different things. Well, I guess ultimately we're all gonna die, yes. But there is also the sense of it's kind of better not to be the jerk at Thanksgiving versus the jerk at Thanksgiving. It's better not to have heart attacks than to have heart attacks. It's better not to be a burden on the people around you. So there's something to be said about management that seems to have something to do with the ability to see the world, to carry oneself, to make better choices. So there seems sort of negation sublation there, but let me give it to Chetan and then Javier. Chetan, please.
I actually wanted to go back to the power question, but I think the philosophy problem has taken us over. I'll go back to it, but for sure. I think with philosophy, there's a very interesting problem, and you take a couple of issues. Personally, I didn't get to philosophy with any crisis, to be honest with you. I myself might have been a crisis for other people, but that's a different
I'm so suspicious of this, Chetan.
I was just maybe jumping across different things, and I got there also in due time. But it's an interesting thing. With philosophy, what happens is that philosophy actually, say, if you have a plumbing issue, you know that problem will not get solved unless somebody solves it. With philosophy, a lot of other things can take the space of that space that philosophy wants to occupy in that sense. A lot of things happen through culture, a lot of things happen through society. There's a lot of other factors take that space that philosophy is trying to sort of legitimize for itself. There's always a contested space, which is why philosophy can be very alienating and scary for certain people also who are rooted into their tradition. Also, I would like to say philosophy isn't always this great thing. I meet a lot of people who are half trained in certain theoretical attitudes, and it becomes much more difficult to talk to them because of that. Because what happens, and this is something psychoanalysis actually knows it, because what happens is eventually your own subjective state, once you have a certain kind of theoretical command, you automatically feel a little superior to everybody else, and you have a language to justify your own subjective states rather than struggling with your own lack. You develop that language very early, and because of that, society can't challenge you beyond a point you're easily successful. And when you actually meet some clear thinker in front of you, you actually think that person is, and I meet a lot of people like that because I teach in a college, and we meet young students who, develop those attitudes at very young ages in that sense.
Can I ask, what are the main ideologies you see here? Are they right-wing, left-wing, religious?
No, I'm primarily discussing left wing. Right wing has different issues. Right wing doesn't have this issue. Right wing is much more easier to talk to in personal one-to-one basis. This is primarily a left wing issue, because it's left wing in India who reads these kind of theoretical, So they would not have read Hegel or Kant, but they would have very strong opinions upon all of these philosophers because certain training in their BA and MA days. It's very strong opinion, and it is almost assumed that at our level nobody would have read them. So not even the teacher would have read them who's teaching them, and not even the students would have read them who are, So you develop and I see that in many faculty members also, older people also, people older than me, in that sense, a decade older than me, in the mid-50s and so on and so forth, that it is very easy to justify your own or cover up your own gap because you have and this is something, if anybody has done some mystical training, if you've been part of any spiritual group, one of the reasons they ask you not to read too much is this only. Because once you start reading too much, the spiritual experience becomes much more difficult. Because then you are much more capable of justifying your own current state. And any new experience becomes that much more, So if you've gone through any kind of mystical, initiation, any spiritual initiation in that sense, you would know a certain kind of friction with philosophy that they have in that sense. And you would have experienced it at some level, I guess, if you've, done it. I remember when I used to, discuss these issues with, I could very clearly see that when I started reading philosophy, I was very aware that this is one of the things that can happen to me in that sense. That at any new experience, and I do still from time to time actually do introspect myself that at what level, what are the experiences that are getting restricted for me because I have such and such knowledge, due to my and a lot of times people, those who do business, for example, those who are lawyers or even economists, they're much more easier to talk toward practical matters. They will understand you much faster and much more sharply than somebody who has simply a critical attitude towards, And how do we think through that problem of practice in that sense? And what is at stake in it? Yeah. I just got that. Power, we'll get back to it.
Can I say something about this? Yeah, Chetan, I think this is this is a great topic to talk about. And what I find in my life is that artists are also oftentimes, not always, and it depends on what kind of art they do, are also tend to be open. For example, like someone who is into, poetry or literature, you can have fantastic, or like music too. But then again, I don't want to say it's general the case, because I've also met like particularly this guy did a lot of with visual art and sculpting and this kind of thing, and he was like not open at all. So maybe it's also about like how linguistic and how notional the art is in nature,
It's an excellent comment. I'll give it to Javier, because there are books like The Vision of the Anointed by Thomas Sowell, The Problem of Intellectuals by Paul Johnson, Blunt Binday, and all of them warn that intellectuals can be some of the most destructive people in history and very dangerous. And I've had the exact same experience with artists, intellectuals, religious people. There's some point where it's almost like they're not human, and that they are their philosophical theory, or they are their religion, and they are an artist. And there's some dehumanization that occurs there that is very, very dangerous. But then on the flip side, I should note, like, it's not like I ever said, oh, I want to be philosophical. I basically found it impossible to understand what happened in a relational conflict without describing it in terms that some people would label as philosophy. That's what happens. You find yourself in, oh, I didn't know talking about different interpretations was philosophy. Yeah, oh, okay. This is the issue. There's a problem of description where when you try to understand things that happened, you find yourself, if you do it long enough, ending up in stuff that people label philosophy. But you never go, oh, I want to be an intellectual today. Oh, I want to use Marxism today. Oh, I want to use Hegel today. You find yourself pulling on those resources to describe the event in the same way that you use the color red or blue or round or fast, adjectives and adverbs, to describe what you saw. You find yourself doing that with philosophy, and that's getting into where it seems like philosophy must always be a product of some kind of philosophical forgetfulness. In the same way that, Javier, we've talked about self-forgetfulness, like the selfish or selfless, it's like you forget yourself. There's some sort of forgetting of the self that seems primary in all of these things. If you say, oh, I'm a Christian, you need to be like Christian forgetful, because when you're like, I'm a Christian, then you impose it becomes destructive. There's some sort of forgetfulness that is kind of central here. But let me give it to Javier, because I know you have to go. Javier.
I want to coin this term now, negative pragmatics. Mainly because, like you pointed out, Daniel, we fundamentally know there's no solution. But I think negative pragmatics would be to stay true to the idea, and this would be the irony part, that actually we have to come up with solutions to prove that there is no solution. That would be the negative pragmatics, in my opinion. Not because what it reveals is that I'm not having hope that it will be fixed, but I'm also not remaining in the negative space that becomes positive by simply saying that, oh, yes, there is no solution, so we do nothing. It needs to be a negative pragmatics where I say, yes, there is no solution, but actually to stay loyal to that idea, you have to constantly justify its facticity. You have to say, okay, now we come up with a solution. But I know it's going to fail, but we have to respond because that is how you stay loyal to the negative facticity of the fact that there is no solution. And I think with love, it's like the same thing. Like you're constantly saying, look, I know we disagree, but like we're always gonna disagree, but you know, fine, I'll do the dishes, whatever. Like I know tomorrow we're gonna fight again about this. Like I know it will happen. You know, because what's gonna happen is someone's gonna say you didn't do the dishes correctly. But you're like, I did the dishes though. So the solution is that but yeah, I'm gonna stop there. I think negative pragmatics is going to be my thing. I think I think I got it.
I would love to be in your kitchen. Oh my gosh. But I did the dishes. Oh wait, there's no final solutions. I'll do them again. Well, there's some sort of thing here where absolutely, when our hot water tank was not working and Mike, the great saint, came and fixed it, there was a very concrete solution. But one day, 30 years from now, it will break again, right? So there's a way where there's a temporal solution, but not an ultimate solution. I think there's some problem of scale here, right? Like in the same way that when we go, there are no solutions. There's one way where you hear that and say, oh, well, F it then. I'm not going to fix the hot water pipe or something, right? Because it's going to break in 20 years. But then there's another part where what it's saying is, when it breaks again, do not be completely deconstructed or like hopeless, because you're ready for it to happen again, right? So there's some sort of language here of there's no ultimate solutions, but that doesn't mean you can't do anything, right? And that seems to be the danger. And in fact, that sounds kind of nihilistic, but actually in a relationship like love, that's extremely good because it means you're active. You're always open to the new. You're never thinking you're done just because you said, I love you, you're finished. You're never finished. And that actually, as negative as it sounds to say there's only temporary solution, no ultimate solution, that actually is the openness of creativity. This is the thing. And now I guess what I would say is, could you say, I know with Julie Rest, it might be that's too positive. I do think, honestly, that the language of negative versus positive may be too blunt to sort of get at things. Because if you're saying, oh, we need to be less therapeutic, then there's a way it's a positive to be less therapeutic, right? And there's a danger where you can always say something is positive. Well, then it could just be like God of the gaps, positive of the gaps. You can always say something's positive or something is negative. And the descriptive language metaphorically may be difficult, even though Julie Rest may not disagree with anything I'm saying. There is, though, something to be said about saying there is no final solutions that keeps you active and thus creative. Is that negative? Is that positive? Well, I think it's open, right? And I'm not sure if the language of negative or positive can be used to assess every possible situation that one carries in life. So metaphorically, there might be, but I do wonder, in the same way that I think Philip Reef's Triumph of the Therapeutic was really hurt by using the language of constraint and releases. I think the word constraint was problematic for his project. It would be better to say givens based on how he describes it, like I tried to in Belonging Again. I do wonder if the language of positives and negatives can actually get in the way of understanding what's being described. I'd be curious how he would respond to that, because I think because the words negative and positive have a judgment in the background, right? And if we're saying that we want to avoid judgment, that's like where you get into Heidegger's nihilation instead, right? He's moving away from negative.
Subtraction be better? Would subtraction be better as a term?
Possibly. Subtraction could be. I just feel like that's where I guess I was talking to you about indifference or replacing positive with therapeutic. Because why is it bad to be positive? Like if I say, oh, we can take the idea of there's no ultimate solutions to have a creative openness. Why is that bad? Right? You say, well, is that too positive or not? It's not clear what the metric is to determine what's too positive or not too positive. Because being open for creativity could suck. You then have to do something. You then have to be active. You have to train. You have to like, is that positive or negative, right? Creativity can be a miserable process, right? Like when you're trying to write a story and you're going through revision 30, it sucks. Like it's creative, but boy, howdy, it sucks. So that's the issue. Like it's not clear when something is positive and when something is negative. Right. And yeah, negative theology, I think it's something apathetic, but negative theology is ultimately a kind of positive in the sense that it's negative because God is always transcendent of all categorization. Is that positive or is that negative? If you say God can never be captured in language, is that negative or is that too positive? According to who? By what metric? It's not clear, you see. That would be sort of one of the problems with the language, in my opinion. Not that the ultimate thrust of the project does not have legitimacy. The language of positive and negative may ultimately still be too one-sided or trapped within a dialectic where we need to move to something more akin to speculative knowing. Now, again, that Miss Resch may have a response to all of that. I'm not saying she doesn't, but that would be my only concern. It may be better as subtraction. What do you think of that? And then I'll give it to Dimitri, but I'll let you respond because I know you have to leave in a minute.
Well, I guess I miscalculated time. I have a little bit more time, so I could probably stay. But I didn't expect. So, I'm doing the negative pragmatic thing. I'm staying. I'm choosing. Yeah, I mean, no, it's a good point. I think I recently watched a little bit of Dawood Gosli's interview with that psychologist.
Oh, I gotta get on that. Yeah.
She said, she basically wrote a book against positive psychology, but she's like, honestly, but like, what the fuck do we mean when we say positive and negative? Like, really? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that is something good to, I mean, yeah, it's funny because in my sociology class, they also use constraints. That's funny. And now I feel like that probably comes from Philip Reeve. Yeah, I mean, maybe subtraction. I think subtraction might be the better term in terms of like the fact that whatever you think it is, subtract it. Like there always needs to be a sort of like Abrahamic sacrifice. Like it's not your idea. It's not your thing. It's always the fact that it's given to you. And then now you have to sacrifice it, that's how I would view it. But I definitely understand that the words themselves are problematic. In my own experience, even with just talking to normal people about it, is absolutely problematic. But I think it reveals, at least in the context of our history right now, it reveals how we kind of need that language. So I think, like you said before, like contextually, I would say we probably need it right now in terms of the therapeutic culture. But overall, in the long run, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's something that would need to survive. It would something the language would need to change.
Well, and I should just note, and I'll give it to Dimitri. I'm extremely sympathetic because, like, take for example these net conversations, right? Like we could be talking right now where we've already talked about something in net conversation 20, and people never seen net conversation 20, and they're like, well, what about X, Y, and Z? And you're like, but we talked about that. We can't talk about everything every single time, right? Likewise, whatever language you use always fails. Then you can start seeing why, like, some philosophers just start using Greek terms or Latin terms. Like, screw it, I'm just going to use some Greek term that nobody knows, so it's like an X variable. And likewise, you see, like, I think Heidegger's movement in the direction of nihilation versus negation is because he's trying to find some term that escapes connotations to really get rid. He's trying with nihilation to talk about some sort of positive negation, frankly. Like you remove as a clearing, and a clearing is a state where being can come forth. And I do definitely associate what Rest is getting with something like clearing. Now, for her, she would say that might be too positive, but that might get into last week's conversation where you can't think you're doing it for the clearing because that removes the negativity that makes the clearing work. Ergo, the religious tension between esoteric and public knowledge, right? So there's a lot of things here. So I'm very sympathetic to the problem, but there is also something to be said, like when we talk about negative versus positive, it's not clear how we determine what makes something positive. What makes something negative? Do you say it's positive because it's a final solution? Well, does that mean management is not positive? That sounds positive because it sounds like you can do something. Yeah, you can do something, but you can never finally do something. So does that pass the smell test or not? So there's some sort of definitional issue there that the terms beg that are not easy to judge. Oh, but wait a minute, final point. If you have to judge them, what do you need? Philosophy. You have to have a horizon by which to do the judge, and therefore we're forced to do this. Like, again, I just find philosophy is what you end up in is if you think long enough. Like, it's not like you want, like, anyone who I've met who makes a point to say we're going to be philosophical, they tend to be terrible to be around. In the same way that people are like really big on being an artist, they tend to be miserable. Like, I'm an artist. And you're like, oh no. So there's something about the declaration that debases. There's something about the declaration that deconstructs, right? So it has to be something that naturally arises. And then when people are like, hey, you guys are doing art. Oh, I guess so. I literally kind of had that experience where people were like, oh, you're writing a novel in like 5th grade? I was like, am I? Oh no, and then threw it away. So that you find yourself in these things almost. But let me give it to Dimitri and then Chetan. And thank you for failing college for us, Javier. It really means the world, sir. But that's negative. So that's Julie Rest would approve. You're failing college. It's great, right? So Dimitri, please.
Something that but I've been thinking about jokes and humor and things like this, and it's a very interesting phenomenon because, what I loved about the podcast that Julie Resch had with Tom McGowan and who was it? I believe it was Catherine Malibu and Alenka Zupancic. Yes, that one. She does something wonderful, and in the beginning, and I admire her for it. I couldn't have done it in the way that she did. She basically, I don't know the exact words that she used, but she said something like, I'm a miserable person. I feel horrible all the time. I hate my life. These kinds of things, and then but it was a trick. She had a trick up her sleeve. It wasn't so innocent as we all might have thought it was, because then she started asking the super personal questions to all these philosophers, which they never talk about this kind of stuff. But because, like I've put it at the beginning, she basically verbally hit herself. They were like, oh, okay, now we can open up as well. And it's so funny because at the end of the conversation, I hope she is watching this right now, Catherine Malibu says, oh, but Julie Resch, why did you do that at the beginning, like beating yourself up so much? And it was like, oh my God, you fell into her plot. You're a genius, Julie Resch. So yeah, I thought that was, that's the power of hysteria right there, and something that's, Daniel, yeah, I agree with you. Like, if you, I put this, I will read it. Bataille, wonderful man, he says, the announcement of a vast project is always its betrayal. No one can say without being comical that he's getting ready to overturn things. He must overturn, and that is all. Stop saying that you're an artist, just make the great art, That's basically the idea behind this. Now, yeah, so Daniel, like basically what you said, like there's a point to like, okay, if you're just like saying, hey, I'm an artist, please listen to me. There's something fake about this. There's like ego going, running amok there. But also, I'm going to take this podcast as example again. Actually, let me first give an example that I heard in a rap song by Polo G. So Polo G is basically, I believe he's from New York, a kind of drill-ish rapper. And at a certain point in his song, it's called like Rap Star, and he's talking about how much money and cars and women he has. And at a certain point in the rap song, he's like saying how he actually hates life. And then he says, I hide behind my insecurities. I hide behind, with the drugs that I use, I hide behind my insecurities. So this dawned me as very strange, and I don't think he realized how Lacanian he was when he said this, because usually we would say, I hide behind my pride or my arrogance or my courage or, my egoic identity to veil the fact that I'm actually insecure. But no, Polo G is more Lacanian than we would think, because he says, no, I hide behind my insecurity itself. That means what? That means that the insecurity is a mask. Now, in this podcast, Tom McGowan and Alenka and Catherine Malibu, it's so funny. They talk about all the books that we write. They are all shit. Every time I write a book, I start hating it. Alenka Zupancic, the way she describes it, she says, when you spit to a cup, it would be horrible to drink it again. And that she's like, yeah, this is basically how it's to write a book for me, you know, like if it's all in here, it's okay. The moment like I actually write it and read it back, I absolutely hate it. Now, yeah, and Tom McGowan says, yeah, I don't think I've ever written a good book. They're all horrible and things like this. And then they also said, yeah, philosophy is so useless because I don't feel like I'm helping anyone. And Tom McGowan says something like, I respond to a lot of people's emails all day long because I feel so guilty as a professor that I'm helping no one, because like who the hell, you know, is going to get a degree in philosophy and then actually get a job with it. But this is mask. This is like it's not such a truthful revelation as it might seem, you know. And I mean, I have not to get too personal here, but a while ago I had this experience that I was with a guy, and he was super humble, super open, very nice to talk with. And a certain moment we started drinking this wine, a great wine, and then it got later, and you know, the darker it gets outside, the more the unconscious starts creeping up inside you, and you know, trying like overtaking the power of your conscious censorship. And then suddenly it came there, it all bursted through, and he had this massive egoic, I want to say megalomaniac explosion, demonic zest in his eyes. It was really kind of crazy. I mean, so that was like really crazy for me to perceive, because it's like, you know, like on the one hand, you can like flagellate yourself and say like, oh yeah, my career boils down to nothing and I'm worthless, even though you're like kind of like philosopher who's esteemed by so many people and admired. And on the other hand, you can also be a guy who's like very humble in your daily life, but then like when you drink a little bit, like you start getting too megalomaniac and everyone around you thinks you're completely insane. So where's the truth? You know, that's my question. Where's the truth? Is it in like that fake humbleness which conceals the megalomania, or is it in you know, the fact that all the great philosophers you know, are like revealing their insecurity about their vocation? In a sense, it's in neither, and it's both, you know. I think definitely they kind of sustain each other. But I mean, Nietzsche was very explicit about him. That's why I like him. Okay, so there's one thing they said in the podcast, and maybe there's some truth to it, but it's not the whole truth. They said, you know, as a philosopher, as a thinker, as an intellectual, I don't feel superior to others by doing this. And I think that's false. Okay, maybe this says a lot about me, but like definitely, like there is something to this, you know, as an intellectual, as a philosopher, you know, you retracting and like being unable to deal in a bodily sense with external reality. So you retreat to your mind, you start thinking, you start cultivating you know, a sense of self in that sense. Like definitely there's ego there, and there's a feeling of superiority there. So yeah, with all that being said, you know, eventually at the end of the day, I don't want to pull the rug underneath anyone. Well, I do, but not in the sense that I just want to dunk on them or something. And I think the fundamental truth is where it's in like the daily life again, you know, like how does this person comport themselves on a daily basis with other people? And like, I think it's fantastic that guy could be so megalomaniac to me in that space that we were in, because I mean, I bet it had to explode at some point, and it's better that it exploded there than at another point. And he's a very loving guy in his daily life, you know. And yeah, so I think that's really what it's about, because we all have this side, you know, we all have this side, whether we try to do it with insecurity and being like, oh yeah, I'm nothing, you know, and then saying to other people, who are you to think that you are so nothing as me, or whether you're like, I'm a great artist, I'm this. So yeah, it's something we gotta juggle all the way until death, I guess. So
No, that's a lovely. You've got some great adventures, Dimitri. I tell you what, you're in an airport, you're drinking. It's a Dostoevsky novel. I mean, there's some good stuff going on. I'll give it to Cheetah and Javier. Well, there's a few things. First, so the question arises: if Julie Rest starting off with a certain negativity then leads to everyone kind of opening up, is that too positive? Right? You can say, oh, that's too positive because something positive arises, right? What's the metric by which you say it's too positive to think of negativity as opening a space for people to be vulnerable, right? And this is where, again, for me, the language of Heidegger, which we can, deconstruct it all we want, where he would ask the question, not if it's negative or positive, but does it open a clearing? And it would seem in that podcast, what you see is Julie Rest opens a clearing where people feel they can come out, shatter everything, like talk freely, right? And because
can I say something more about this? I hate to interrupt you, but the actual point I wanted to make before I went on my tirade is that by basically laying the basis for I hate life, everything's horrible, it was such a funny podcast and it was so jolly and everyone's so happy of being there. So I love that. Like no one tried to be like, oh my God, poor little child, let me embrace you. No, it's like there's the negativity and then it's like, oh, we can laugh about it, So I like that disposition. I'm like this.
Well, the best reflection on this, in my opinion, is the beginning of Message in the Bottle, The Delta Factor by Walker Percy, where he goes through on why are people happiest when there's a thunderstorm coming? Why is it that suicide rates are in the like the richest areas? Rich people commit suicide more often than poor people, right? Why is it that Kafka was apparently just the happiest guy you ever met, right? Like Walker Percy is really, really reflecting on this, and he's actually very interested in this kind of weird thing that negativity opens positivity, right? But if negativity and positivity are basically always linked or seem to be linked, then the question of too much or too little positivity may not capture the language we're getting at. And that's where Heidegger, right, again, there's a clearing where it's opened up and then people are having a great time because you've gone through the negativity and now there's a kind of clearing that occurs, right? Likewise, there seems to be the question becomes and this is where also why does beauty ontologically is it so important? Because there's a clearing. Oh, wait, something has broken forth. The world is not what we thought it was. There's a kind of clearing of phenomenon, disclosing a different kind of being, right? And what I see Julie Rest pointing out to is that therapeutic culture, and this would be Philip Reef as well, gets in the way of the disclosure of the truth of the human subject, which is more of this kind of walking paradox, which is this kind of being of whom when they want an ultimate solution, then they're actually more miserable by it. And what you need today in an overly positive culture, as I understand, like you say, Julie Rest's language makes a lot of sense in the historic moment, because what in the historic moment you need is negativity to function as the annihilation for the clearing that discloses the actual ontological state of human beings, that if we do not correctly approach, we cannot address human beings in their current situation. And that, again, is always the tension, right? Like when you write a book, in the same way we said when you fix the pipes, you don't ultimately fix the pipes, you only fix them for now, but in 20 years they break again. You have to decide when you write a book if you're addressing 2023 through 2030 or all of human history. And of course, it's probably impossible to write a book that has a language that will have perfect address for any moment of history, right? Because what if everyone forgets language? Or what if annihilation comes to be a simile for negativity, right? So this is the problem. You cannot, in the same way as you cannot ultimately fix the pipes, you likewise cannot ultimately write a book that's going to address every historic moment ever, except maybe Hegel. But even Hegel, you can all argue, has certain linguistical problems, or you get lost, or you only read the phenomenology of spirit, and you never get to the science of logic. And because of publication constraints, he can't combine phenomenology of spirit. And then people teach classes like existential readers where they pull out sections of the slave-master dialectic, and it loses the context. And Hegel can't do anything. There's nothing Hegel can do. He can't write a book that forces everyone to treat his project in its fullness, therefore it can be lost in the historic moment. So what Julie Rest is dealing with, which I think everyone deals with, is the problem of trying to write to something that is not contingent, bound by contingency. You have to write to someone in a historic moment. You cannot fix the pipes forever, but in so doing, you have to choose between a language that may be more timeless versus a language that may better address the moment. And you must make those trade-offs. And so I'm very sympathetic in trying to write books to these publication concerns. Like you have these restrictions of writing in history, really. That proves very, very problematic. But let me give it to Chetan and then Javier. Chetan, please.
It's an interesting discussion actually on the question of language, something which I struggle with myself one degree or another. The question that I ask myself many times is, at what point language stops working? Either language becomes too fixed, where it becomes too fixed, where it cannot become ambiguous, where it cannot be figurative. At those points, realize that it starts moving slower than it should. And either on the other side becomes too ambiguous, too slippery. Even there, its movement becomes too free. It's just like a chain in a cycle. If either chain gets blocked, it will not move at all. The other side becomes it will come off the rings and it will move too freely. In either of the two situations, you can't ride the cycle in that sense. Now, language is something of that nature. I think if we contextualize what Julie Reche is saying there, and I haven't read her book, I just saw her podcasts and interviews and stuff. I think what she's saying is that there's a problem when, say, when somebody comes to you in therapy and you get on to curing that person in that sense. You get on to thinking that there is some way through which this language of cure, therapy, becoming better is actually addressing that problem in that sense. And it is there she's bringing, I think, a way to radically accept and address the negative dimension of the psychoanalytic moment in that sense. That there is some kind of a problem in this therapeutic expectation itself that she's trying to sort of push back. And then I think the negative word is, as Daniel rightly is saying, is emerging from that very, very contingent historical moment where positive has taken a certain connotation from which it can't escape. The question becomes, can language be possible which doesn't respond to its own contingent moments? Can language, and as Daniel raised this question, language, if it has these dimensions where it has more timeless sort of appeal and something, I think these two dimensions are somewhere inherently interlinked also. Something becomes truly timeless when it completely and unabashedly addresses something much completely contingent. In that sense, there is some kind of a linking between these two sides, which which we need to think about in the case of language. Language simply cannot be divided between, in that sense, or split between between its current context and its future interpretations. In that sense, there's something which stops that split from completely taking place. Given that, I agree with Daniel personally. I agree with Daniel that there is a problem with the word negative, the way she's using it. As I said, I have not read the book, but I do see a problem there, and I think I can see where Daniel is coming from on that. In that sense, that my problem with her is not that she's not responding to a current contextual moment in that sense and so on. My issue is that the current contextual moment, the response to the current contextual moment may actually make us give up the other word, make us give up the opposite. I think that is where Daniel is also coming from. That I think what I'm hearing in his language is that are we very easily giving up the word positive? There's a certain politics to it attached to it. Is it that simple to simply give up that word? And what is at stake in giving up that word? That is also something which is part of our context itself. That if we completely say, okay, we let go of that word and we adopt a word which generally sort of emerges in contrast to, then aren't we making negative positive itself? Is that a simple game we are playing? That we're making the negative word positive and the positive word making the negative, isn't it? That's what you're slipping there. that the word negative will suddenly take positive connotations with time if we accept a framework. And the word positive will start taking negative connotations. So what would happen essentially is that when you go to somebody and say, oh, I'm doing something positive, the other person will interpret immediately, oh, you're doing something negative actually. Can you see what I'm saying? That we have actually just switched the words. Have we done something more than that? What is at stake?
Piton, I have a
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? You said something very, very interesting. We might want to talk about like Plato and Hegel in this. Like, what do you mean by affirming a contingency and having a timeless language in this kind of sense?
But if you think about it, one of the places, for instance, Hegel actually sort of puts it, and this is something which is a context which is coming in a lot of filmmaking today. That how do you make a film which is universal to different cultures? So initially, a lot of people started putting in money to say films which had these universal appeals, and a lot of those movies sort of started going down very fast, and people started realizing that movies which actually become universally applicable are actually movies which are deeply rooted in some particular cultural context. For some reason, a particular actually has this, and Hegel gets the relationship between particular and universal in that manner. That affirming the particular actually has a much more greater claim on the universal than simply directly escaping into the, Can you see that? So something deeply of that same structure actually works in language also. Language actually functions its most clearer form once it directly engages with its own contingency in the very context contingent form. One of the thinkers that you should read to think about it is Wittgenstein actually. For Wittgenstein, which is why context is where language finds its ground. You can't have this context-free language at all. That language becomes too slippery for Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is one thinker who actually gets it right, which is why Wittgenstein is so often used in anthropology. That Wittgenstein doesn't allow this split in language to take place in this manner. So for Wittgenstein, formalization of language beyond a point, leaves its own context behind, which is Wittgenstein's problem in metaphysics also. So he will go that far, that he would actually argue against metaphysics because for him, at whatever point language leaves its own context, language becomes, in that sense, it's an interesting conversation to have between Wittgenstein and Hegel in that sense. Because how is Hegel sort of, conserving its metaphysical dimension while actually having this loyalty to the concrete, as he would call it in Hegelian, thinking. One of the papers that I want to write for Kettle is actually this one. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do it or not, but this is one of the thinking that would go into this problem. I'll just sort of shut up now. It's been just too long. Yeah, I'll just come back.
No, those are excellent comments. And Jacob, Kishere, good to see you. I'll give it to Javier. So there's almost a sense. So a few things come to mind. First, in the same way that we've needed people to translate, say, languages to other languages, like Russian to English, for example, it seems to me we will increasingly need almost historical translators, meaning that you would go, oh, in the 1870s, the word positive didn't have that connotation, whereas it does today, and we have to see past that, like this kind of understanding. The other thing I think is there's a kind of new ethic of readership that is starting to come upon us. And what I mean by that is you could argue that a lot of the humanities departments and a lot of universities have made a career out of going, oh, this doesn't, this negative always becomes a new positive, because I think it's a fair critique. And you say, oh, therefore, Julie Ress's project is not any good. Well, I think what's actually kind of the new ethical readership is to kind of understand that Julie Ress is bound with language. She has to make a choice between the historic episode or not. And Julie Ress may actually have responses to all that. So we should let her speak or let her have a new book. Whereas in the past, what ends up happening is there's almost like, well, there almost is like you make a career out of critiquing someone, right? Like you kind of make a certain oh, they're inadequate. Oh, they did that wrong. And it's almost like now, especially with greater freedom of the internet and information, that ethic or that way of do things is outdated. Like, it's just not the correct way to do things, because even if maybe it was necessary in the past to navigate information and to figure out what books to read and what not to read, things have shifted. and a new kind of ethic of readership where, like, so for example, you just understand that there's this radical problem of contingent language and timeless language, and all language will be inadequate, and yet should we write nothing? Maybe, but then we have this problem of pragmatics, horizon, and all these different stuff. So there's, I think, a new ethic of reading that we need to think about today. In the same way of meta-language skills we've talked about before, so on and so forth. I will note that perhaps timeless language is story, mythology, imagery, and I think actually it'd be curious to see a movement from hieroglyphics all the way to sort of language we have today, because you say, oh, that's a bird. I'm Greek or Chinese or whatever. I can see that Egyptian temple. That's a bird picture. I know that's a bird. And that's kind of like timeless because you see the image. There is something about a movement from image to sound that is a movement from timeless to contingent. But then, of course, like one of the reasons you become contingent is because it's really hard to draw a lot of pictures. Like there's a, language is very slowed down by trying to draw imagery and different things, right? And so you kind of move in the direction of the written word in order to speed up communication. But then there is the risk of having language that is more contingent than timeless in that. But maybe today with Zoom, there's some kind of like return to imagery because you're recording Zoom and this is an image, but it's also language. I do wonder if we've gone from oral tradition, written tradition, and now it's like Zoom tradition, or like cipher tradition, where it's a new sort of like, it's like you are recording like you did with the written language in a book, but now you're more able to record conversation. There's something interesting to think of like written tradition, oral, and Zoom. Not that I'm saying we have to go with that, but I'm just throwing it out there, where there's some kind of new possible form of literacy and communication that is developing that I think calls for a new ethic of readership, a new ethic of charity and interpretation, historic translation, and so on and so forth. But it is interesting to think of the image as possibly dealing with all of this. But then, of course, if William Ong is correct, where the image got in the way of our ability to do scientific treatise because abstract reasoning is necessary for the development of mathematics and science, then it was good that we moved to more contingent language, because funny enough, more contingent language made it more able to think of the non-contingent. There are all these weird paradoxes that William Ong kind of explores. But now the question would be, what now? What is this new historic moment? But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera.
Yeah, so, I mean, Julie Reshi, yeah, I mean, I got so many questions to ask her, so I'll be curious. But I think, I will say, I think Chitan's right in the sense that when I pay attention to Julie Resch, actually, there is no positive as such. It is only, there is a slight in the book, in her book, she calls it in a kind of very indirect way that every positive is a modification of the negative. So what does it mean when we're doing modification? Now, I wonder if actually what we're trying to get at is that actually the positive is the way to stop movement. That it's actually the negative that moves. It's the negative that only moves. And the reason why we're able to even proclaim that a negative becomes positive is because we've decided it stopped moving in some sense. But the thing is, language does that. Language does that. But we take it away when we interpret and translate when we hear words, because the assertion of language is positive. But it already fails because you have to interpret what is being said. So already the negative is taking place. Julie Resch, she talks about this, like thinking and language is inherently positive for her. That's why that's why she like kind of laughs, because she goes, she understands that in almost like meta way, that even her use of meta, her use of positive and negative is already a positive assertion. she knows that. But I do think, and I've been wondering about this interpretation of, I've been trying to think of how I should interpret her. Because I want to say that whether we use negative or positive, I want to say that there is, if we think of, instead of like a kind of dualism between positive and negative, I would say that actually it's the negative that moves. It has to be the negative that always moves. And it's only when we feel confident or comfortable in that negative that it already becomes positive. And I think if you understand that, you understand that actually you're no longer in the negative anymore. And I think that's what she wants us to be constantly vigilant over, is paying attention to that movement. Now, I'm totally okay with accepting clearing as Heidegger's clearing or something, because in some sense, I would say that's probably what it is. You know, that if you pay attention to the movement, this is actually what connects us as human beings. But then also, the failure is what connects us as human beings too. So there is something to that as well. Like, I have to be careful with that, because you know, like that failure is what actually connects us. That's what she's trying to say. But the moment we get comfortable with that, then we're not connecting anymore, basically. That's the problem. And so that's how quick the negative can be modified into positive. And so, yeah, I'd be curious to what you think, because I'm wanting to say more now that really when we talk about negative, it's something that cannot be conceptualized, but it's the fact that it always moves. And so in some sense, there is a dialectic going on, but there is that core undialecticizable negativity, or we don't have to call it negativity, that she's talking about. That there's something that always moves beyond that, or at the core. But go ahead.
Maybe quickly intervene here. I remember Deleuze having this very interesting book called Nietzschean Philosophy. He's a very great writer for the thinkers, Deleuze, in that sense. You know, his book in Kant and especially Nietzsche is amazing. So he writes there that where Hegel sees a no, Nietzsche sees a yes.
Mm.
You know, and I think Julie Resch's book, if Deleuze would have to see that book, he would immediately, you know, say this is the really Hegelian moment there, in that sense. That you know, that movement from the no to yes, what Deleuze would call a distinction between Apollo and Dionysus. And it's not, the Apollyon god and the Dionysus. Apollo and Dionysus in that sense, and we can have a discussion what does it stand for. Of course, he's not saying Hegel is Apollo in that sense. What he's saying is that both of those gods in that sense stand in opposition to Hegel in some sense, because Hegel can't think the Dionysus. In some sense, Hegel can't think the affirmation in suffering in that sense. Suffering becomes meaningless to Hegel. And Julie Resch's book is an interesting book because it stands right at that edge, you know, which on one side wants to completely affirm the suffering, but on the other side remains in the spectrum of no. She can't think a yes in that space, suffering, because the language she's employing and so on and so forth. And it's really interesting thing to read these two texts together, what she's doing and reading Deleuze and what comes out of it.
But you know, this is the question that I want to ask her, because I want to know would she accept a dispositional understanding, that actually this is a dispositional thing, that what she's pushing for, like, meaning, like, you know, when William James talks about there's a sick soul and then there's like the more optimistic soul or something like that, like, you know, they're conceiving the same reality, but the disposition is more melancholic versus optimistic or something like that. I've been very curious about whether she would accept a dispositional thing, because in the beginning of her book, she states, this is for those who, you know, suffering, don't want to live that affirmative view. But there's a lot of things in her writings that makes me believe that she would reject it. But there's things that she says in the book that would make me believe that actually what she's saying is that she's just offering, in an affirmative world, she's offering a no. But that's something I have to ask her.
I personally don't think that it's a question that can be resolved at this level. At the level of, you know, how you think about your work. At least, and as far as I can understand, there is a niche in that line of thinking. It's a question that has to be resolved or thought through at the level of what you're doing itself. What is it that is coming in appearance itself through your work in that sense for Deleuze. So if you think about what Deleuze is thinking about with Dionysus is that in the Dionysian sort of thought process, and I'm personally I have a certain kind of affinity with what Deleuze is saying there. But I normally I read a philosopher, but I don't normally internalize it beyond a point in that sense. You understand something and you move on to the next thing that you want to understand. But Dionysus is something which attracts me one bit more than other philosophies do. What he's saying there is something interesting. He's saying that pain always, in some senses, enters into certain question of economy. I'm using the word, he doesn't use it. I was trying to search for the quote, I couldn't find it immediately. It's there in my paper, the Jussan's paper, where my pain is always immediately, automatically somebody else's suffering. And somebody else's enjoyment. And somebody else's enjoyment, if you think about Jussan's and you take it one step further, my pain is also immediately my own enjoyment in some senses. There's no pain possible without that limited of extra limited, satisfaction built into that idea of pain. So pain in itself for Deleuze or Dionysus can never be completely meaningless. Like people tell me that Jussan's is meaningless. I see that there's a problem in simply thinking of it in that manner. I think Jussan's is probably the most meaningful part of the whole spectrum, also in that sense that not because it is immediately useful, not because of that reason. It's meaningful precisely because it is not immediately useful in that sense, but it's meaningful in the sense that if you have to affirm suffering in that manner, and exactly what Julia is trying to do, she's trying to affirm suffering, she's trying to affirm the negative dimension of things. But if you need to do that, you need to do that not through saying and not through the Hegel, that for Deleuze, this is what dialectics to do, not through certain movement. Oh, today you're feeling pain, tomorrow you'll feel something else. Not through that. Today this is happening, this will lead to that. This kind of an exchange. No. It has to be done because pain immediately itself affirms itself. How do we think through that? Not because today's pain will become something good tomorrow. Can you see the difference? In Hegel's dialectics for Deleuze, there is this movement taking place that today's pain, today's contraction will become another contraction day after tomorrow, and it will lead to something else. And there's this step-by-step process happening. Deleuze have a problem with that process. He has a problem because what he's trying to say is, and we can go back and reinterpret Hegel with Deleuze in lens, and that kind of work is already done by Zizek in that sense. But what he's saying is that can you do without doing that? What is at stake when you want to do it, and when you want to claim and find a philosophy in immediately an affirmation of the suffering? So to be honest, I myself struggle with that question. So when I go and work with marginal communities, really marginal communities, caste groups, Dalit class groups, and so on and so forth, sometimes when I enter the community, I do think that the suffering is meaningless. Sometimes you take that attitude. And what that book made me do is it made me reflect upon that attitude in my own self. Sometimes you want to go there and simply improve their lives. You think you are this messiah who will go, you will teach kids, and they will become some great. Nothing of that nature is going to happen. I'll be just another cog in the wheel, if maybe one or two kids might benefit by my presence. Nothing else in that sense, in that immediate sense. But there is another dimension in which things are happening. But what is that dimension about? That's maybe the best I could do at this moment. Maybe I'll just get the quotes out.
I'll give it to Javier, but as we come up on the close, if anyone has final things, I think that's an extremely important question that is just asked. There is kind of this tendency to, suffering will lead to good, this kind of movement, but is that so guaranteed? Because if we say it does that, then it's not abyssal. We've all been playing on this idea that there is no guarantees, and I do think Julie Ress is fighting guarantees, like a guarantee that things will do X, Y, and Z. Well, that arguably would be a real good reason to do philosophy, because if there are no guarantees, you want to be ready, right? You want to be prepared. You want to have abilities to interpret. You don't know when the strong man is going to come and try to manipulate you. You don't know when bad ideas are going to enter your head about relationships and then destroy your marriage or different things, right? And it's almost like, I guess the way I was thinking about it as you were talking, when I store things in the garage, like I get something and I store it in the garage, I don't know that I'm going to use it, but I also don't know that I'm not going to use it. So I store it. But then there's a risk of being a hoarder, right? Where you just save everything and you never throw stuff away. So like recently I cleaned the garage and I can get a car in it now, which is kind of a miracle. But it did require a kind of agony of throwing things away that you're like, I might need this one day. Well, I hope I don't. And you throw it away, right? And I wonder sometimes if the question of like, oh, is it useful or useless? Sometimes that may not be the adequate metaphoric structure to think about ideas. And it's more like the question of, will I keep this in the garage or throw it away? Will I go to the thrift shop and see if I can get a deal? Like, I'll join a net conversation. There might be ideas I can use or not. But then you go, it's like, oh, I just spent 2 hours cluttering my mind with ideas and now I'm hoarding and I'm not living, right? And you're always having to make that judgment. It's almost like, to me, and I'll give it back to you, Chicha, it's almost like that's the question. Like that's metaphorically more of what we're talking about with philosophy, the question of storing in the garage or throwing away. And let me tell you, when you need, like my brother called last night needing bungee cables, and so there are times like, glad I had that, but then there are other times it's like, I've had these bungee cables for 10 years and I should really throw them away. And then you do, and the next day your brother needs them, right? So it's almost like that is the tension side. But let me give it to you, Chetan.
I'll just quickly say, for example, Alan Bourdieu's event, that has this immediate, not delusion sense, but it has this positive dimension with Dolly sessions. I think questioning, and there's a problem with that. You know, that's the difference between Bourdieu's event and Lacan's real. Lacan's real has much more horror built into it in that sense. You know, and that distinction about useless and useful, I'll just come back and there's something very interesting to be said over there. I think that's a great point to make, Daniel. Yeah.
Oh well, because it's like it's like that. Like I really do feel like reading books reminds me of the question of, do I keep this in the garage or not? Not really like, it's like, oh, I better read these books because like I better store all these things. I might need them one day. And then you're a hoarder. But then there's some wisdom in keeping things, right? And you have to find this balance between keeping things you may need, taking the time. It's like, oh man, this item's on sale. I better get it because I might use it one day. And then it's on sale and it sits over there and you never use it. You're like, well, yeah, sure, I saved $200 on that computer, but I never used the computer, so it actually wasn't a good deal, right? So it's almost like that's kind of sometimes the question of use and useless metaphorically. I have more to say, but I will give it to Javier and then back to Chetan. Javier, please.
So, man, yeah, this is this is like some hard stuff. I don't even know, because Julie Resch rejects jouissance completely. She rejects jouissance. The question that I wonder about is, what is the trade-off with rejecting jouissance? But also, if we always accept jouissance, what are we not seeing when we always accept jouissance? And that's the thing that I'm curious about, because for Julie Resch, we have this, I guess for her, we have this self-defense mechanism where we always want to embrace the death drive, but we never do, really. We like always say yes, and then we take 2 steps back and never centralize the death drive. And so even saying that there's an economy between pleasure and pain, she's still saying that that is still an escape from the death drive. That is still not really facing the death drive. Now, I understand that's controversial, because I know, as far as I know, she's the only one that's doing this. She's the only one that's saying no to jouissance and, you know, rejecting that. She's like death drive all the way. Which, I mean, I have to say, I'm baffled, because I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I'm at my peak here with, is there, you know, I don't even want to say if there's consequences, because if we say there's consequences, I think for her, she would be like, so now you're trying to think solutions or something like that. I don't know. You know, but I mean, the last chapter is something I have to read again, because she refutes all her premises in the end. basically, which shows that she fails in the book. And so, yeah, but I am curious to start thinking about Julie Resch, her emphasis of the death drive as central against Julie Sans. What is that? What does that look like? Because I think a lot of us take Julie Sans as like, this is crucial, like this is important, this is crucial, this is how basically like almost like reality functions. Like we have a kind of enjoyment in our suffering and so on. But she's trying to even say that actually this enjoyment in the suffering is actually what prevents you from meeting the other. So I want to explore that those trade-offs, because I do agree with you, Daniel. There has to be something that's going on with Julie Sans and this centralization of the death drive. What is happening in that? But I'll leave it there.
I want a bumper sticker for the back of my car that says "Death Drive all the way." I'd love to see the reaction of people behind me. They're like, "What does that mean?" I'd be driving. I'll give it to Chetan, and now I want like the ultimate celebrity death match between Death Drive and Julie Sans, and I'll have like the clay figures in the MTV show. It'll be grand. But let me give it to Chetan. Chetan, please.
I think Hannah Arendt had this very beautiful essay called "What is Culture" in her book Between Past and Future, where she addressed this question of useful and useless objects in that sense. And you're absolutely right, Daniel, in that sense that we need to evaluate the useless on its own ground without making it, just because something is useless doesn't mean you have to keep it. Of course not. You just hold it in that sense. You need to evaluate the useless object on its own ground without making it useful. That's the challenge. That's a challenge that she was sort of picking up in that essay. And her argument was that if you think about it, culture is one of those things in the human sort of social organization which cannot be completely made for useful objects. If culture becomes completely this question of usefulness, you'll enter into some kind of mass society. Culture needs to preserve things which are not immediately put in use. If you even make those judgments from simply calculation, what will come into use later will preserve those, you'll fail. You'll again get into simply social, some form of social grouping, which will completely have totalizing impact upon culture. No culture can survive under that pressure. Culture demands useless objects which are kept for their own sake, and still they also have a way to evaluate what is kept and what is not kept, not by simply putting it into the useful. That's the, I think, challenge that I think, Daniel, you were trying to raise for us with philosophy also. That what are the grounds for evaluating something which is, something which cannot be immediately brought into this distinction between useless and useful. I guess, that's the, I think, interesting question to ask there. And how does culture work? And we can ask those. I think the other point about dead drive, I totally agree with, I can see what she's doing in that way, Javier. I can see where she's going with it. And she's saying that to completely affirm the no, in that sense, we need to strip it of the supplements or the complements that no gives us. In that sense, that's the position. Am I right? That whatever little that you're getting from this affirmation of the no, there is some kind of affirmation possible when you stop taking anything from affirming it itself. What is that politics about? And I have my full, in that sense, backing to that project to that degree. I'm just not sure, I have not read the book. I haven't engaged with her in any depth, to be honest to you. But I have my own sort of quirky, certain kind of distancing from that project when it becomes a political question of, okay, how do I manipulate you into affirming that no? By taking away language from you, by taking away, that pessimism always has a dimension to it. There's always something manipulative about pessimism in that sense. Always been, to the extent that pessimists are great thinkers in that sense that they will always be able to much more clearly see reality because they're not attaching themselves to any kind of, there's something about it. But at the same time, time, the whole idea of thinking is dependent upon something you're getting from it in the end, eventually, even if you're the worst of pessimists. And once your politics is to hide what you're getting from it, then something different, some kind of politics has to be unfolded there in that domain, I guess. I'm not sure. Yeah. Thanks.
That was all excellent. First off, Julie Ress, if you're saying this, I do agree that the culture is very therapeutic and overly positive, and negativity is needed. Actually, because when people if they're told that normal is positive, then when they don't feel positive, they think they're not normal, and it can be very destructive. So that project is very valid. The question is the historic contingency of the language of negativity, and like we've been talking about. And I think there is a risk of negative just becoming a simile for positive in different contexts. But again, Julie Ress, if you're watching this, you easily have responses to all of that. I think also, so a few more things. I definitely think that metaphorically, it can be more useful to think of the questions of philosophy as, do I keep in the garage or not? Versus use or not use. Because what's so interesting about that is that may actually speak to Julie Ressi's pushing against solutions. I don't know if keeping these Christmas lights will be a solution to me needing Christmas lights in 4 months. I may need them, I may not, but it's kind of unclear. And so if I keep it in the garage, I run the risk of being a hoarder, taking up space and not being confident in my ability to throw something away. But if I do keep it and it turns out to be a solution, at the time of the choice, I didn't know it was a solution. And so it has this interesting metaphoric way of kind of being a solution, but also abyssal, actually. It's like the pure choice of, I will keep these Christmas lights, and you don't know. And if it's a solution, it's secondarily a solution. And maybe that metaphorically is getting at it, because I do associate what we do with ideas more with the decision of keeping something in a garage or not, which is an abyssal choice that is secondarily a solution or not, but you can't know. And so metaphorically, that might be getting a little more at it. But then, of course, you have to spend the money to have the garage. You have to keep it there. There are sacrifices you have to make to even have the choice to keep or not to keep. So there's another level that seems to balance the solution thinking. I'll give it to Javier. There's a number of other things that I think are very interesting to me on all this. I did want to note earlier, I talked about maybe the image is more timeless versus abstract language. That's actually probably why it's more risk of being an idol, though, right? Like everyone knows what the gold cap is, so it's more prone to idolatry. So you move to the spoken word that's less, that's more abstract, which saves you the problem of idolatry, but it's more historically contingent. So that should be a note there that there's a trade-off here. The last thing I'm going to say is I think all of this, I just want, and I'll give it to Javier. I do think that there is something here where negativity loosens from the dogmatic slumber, where if you're kind of frozen, it kind of, and maybe this is where we have to think, I do really like Ebert's freak theory as a metaphysical description, and it's very akin to the sections toward the end of the doctrine of being of the science of logic, whereas instead of positive and negative, you talk about attract and repel. And it's a movement, and then you reach an equilibrium, and it's a phase shift, and there's things like that. Where if today what we have is too much attracting, then it becomes stagnant. So you need the movement. So maybe like that's the issue, is what Julie Ress is in some trying to describe is a movement, which would then kind of align it maybe with some of the freak theory. That's a thought that comes to mind. And then I guess the other thing is with the death drive, there is something here that maybe what we can say on what you're getting at, Javier, and I'll let you respond to this. I was reading Blood Meridian recently, Cormac McCarthy, and he wrote No Country for Old Men and different things. And what I would say is a way to think about evil in Cormac McCarthy is, you know how we say God is not God, like Master Eckhart, because, you know, it's apathetic. In McCarthy, evil is apathetic. Whatever you say is Satan is not Satan, because it's way worse than that, actually. Whatever you think is evil is not that, right? There's almost a way in which the death drive is not that. Like what he's trying to say is like, oh, you think the death drive has a secret pleasure? No, it's not that. It's something more. Actually, that's part of it, but there's actually a deeper sort of level that's always lurking, right? In the same way in McCarthy, evil is not evil. It's more accurate to say Satan doesn't exist, because whatever you think Satan is worse than that. It's kind of like apathetic evil versus apathetic God. Likewise, maybe there's something here with Julie Ress, I'm not sure, where it's kind of like she's like, The moment you talk about the death drive, you're not talking about the death drive. The moment you talk about God, you're not talking about God. It's deeper than that. It's deeper than that. And actually then, in the same way that an apathetic God keeps you always moving, because you can never get a stagnant idea of God. It's not that. It's not that. It's almost like an apathetic death drive keeps the movement, like in a freak theory thing, because it's not that. Keep going. It's not that. It keeps going. Well, you can see it as a source of movement, but then is that captured in the language of positive and negative? Because I would argue if you understand beauty, you can do the same with beauty. Whatever you say is beautiful. No, it's not that. It's not that. Keep going. Keep going. And you see, if the goal is movement, let's put it this way. If the goal is to maintain movement, you can do it with an apathetic death drive per se, but you could also do it with an apathetic beauty, I think, or mystery or Dante. So it doesn't have to be fundamentally negative. That would be my counter to say, like, if she's claiming the only way to have the movement ontologically is negative, I don't know if that's the case, because I can actually phenomenologically attest to these kind of transcendent mysteries like you see in beauty as having another source of movement that can never be fully captured, right? And that thing goes back to the ancient theological traditions between beauty or disaster as being the source of the awakening, right? You either have the cross or you have the resurrection, you have the beauty or you have the destruction. It would seem like both of those could be sad, but I don't know, Julie Rest may be like, yeah, if you're talking about beauty as that sort of like green leaf bull, Dante, this passion, death and beauty combined, that's perfectly fine. But it seems like you need, I'll give it to you, Javier. It seems like you either need apathetic beauty per se or apathetic death drive per se, because otherwise the nature of human thought is to lose the movement. And if we lose the movement, then we undergo a sort of self-effacement. But let me give it to you, Javier Rivera.
No, yeah, I think that's a good question. This is the part that I still want to ask her, because Todd McGowan talks about beauty in one of the interviews, right? And she pushes against him, and she goes, yeah, but if beauty is a benefit, then it's a positive. Like, I don't want anything to do with it, right? But then Todd McGowan says, I really like his response on this. Todd McGowan goes, yeah, but I think beauty is the only benefit that is a process. Actually, that it's the only one that cannot be a sort of like benefit as an end goal. It's a benefit as a process in itself. And my interpretation of that interview, Julie Resch doesn't push any further against that. I want to say that actually she accepted that. Why did she accept that? I don't know. Because beauty is something, I mean, I think we would all say is something like almost positive, right? I mean, and she does talk a lot about forgiveness and sacrifice, and these are all, I would say, positive theological concepts, but she interprets them as negative actions, so to speak. Now, just to briefly talk about what you're talking about, like usefulness and uselessness. I think this is the same problem when people start talking about letting go, right? Letting go, I think the reason why it's so problematic is because you assume that you had something to let go in the first place. That's what's already problematic. And I think because you're thinking in the paradigm of, oh, I had something, now I have to let go of it. Oh, I had something, now I have to let go of it. But actually, what Julie Resch would be saying, no, actually, you never had it. You never had it in the first place. So, in some sense, what you're giving is your nothing, and what you have is your nothing. And sacrifice and forgiveness for her is exactly that. You are sacrificing nothing for nothing. And so I think she's trying to break that dialectic of what makes us think that, oh yeah, I had something, now I gotta let it go, so on and so on. And I think it's the same thing with the usefulness and the uselessness. Like, that also traps us into thinking that there are things that have some utility and not utility, but it's like, that's not true. You know, there's something more fundamental than that. And so, yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I think we can say that this is where my work on Plato, I want to say that actually apophatic beauty is the death drive. like like in a real sense, because I think the effacement of the desk drive, if you don't embrace it as a process, is what is disastrous. You could say on the opposite end of beauty, it's disaster. But it's funny because disaster looks positive in that sense, right? Because I think beauty is, I almost want to say beauty in a negative sense is a kind of like destruction. It is a negative, like you're constantly striving forward. And I have a hard time not thinking about the death drive in Plato's forms. Like there is something that is not it. Like it's not it in a way. But I'm gonna end it there.
When you fail college because you never go to class due to us, just say it was the Nets' fault. They'll understand. They'll be like, oh, those jerks. Alas, I fear I must come up with the end, but if anyone has final, so a few things come to mind. First off, I think something that can help with the question of what is philosophy in the business of, is often when we ask that, we think about we ourselves thinking philosophical thoughts, when actually it can be more helpful to think of philosophy as, what do we see? You mentioned Plato and Socrates as what? Dialogue, relational. Like we don't tend to metaphorically associate philosophy with something we're doing with other people and a sort of description of the between space, say between us and the world or us and other people, and the hermeneutical differences. When you see that and you have the problem of I can never access the other person's consciousness, there's a fundamental unknown there that is actively affecting my life and interpreting me, and I have to interpret back. What do we do with that? And also they're in a world that I think is externally real that we're occupying together. How do we navigate that? Because we cannot navigate it by mere pragmatism. Because if you could say, well, of course I love you, wife. I gave you rings and food and housing. I never talked to you, but you know I love you because your determinations and materiality said it thus. We know that is inadequate, right? So right there is something invisible that we're having to live with. So I think, first off, if we think of philosophy, as I like to put it, intersuppositionally, between us and world, us and other people, hermeneutically, and it's like a figuring out the game, the structure, the football field in which we're getting at, that can sort of help. So metaphorically, I think there can be a mismatch that gets in trouble. Second, I think another thing we can get at that's very interesting with philosophy is it's similar to a problem of literature. In literature, and let's say if I were to ask you, is there a difference between when I describe a cup of coffee and when Marcel Proust describes a cup of coffee, or Faulkner, right? You would say, well, of course, I know Marcel Proust is way better at describing a cup of coffee, or maybe McCarthy. I was just reading him, right? And we would say that there are better descriptions than not, right? We would not say they are all equal. And what's really weird is the ability, like when you read McCarthy, you're like, how did this guy pull this off? Like, this is crazy. Like, how is he able to describe this battle with the Indians in a manner that is simultaneously horrifying, but beautiful and violent and yes, transcendent? How did he do it? Well, apparently he edited stuff for years and he worked really hard, and it's unbelievable ability. Yes, everyone can describe, but like maybe 1 out of 100 million people over decades can do what McCarthy can do, right? I think sometimes philosophy is trying to do something like description, actually. And there are better descriptions than not. And descriptions that are done well can unlock things that descriptions that cannot do well cannot unlock. And this is what becomes difficult, because it would seem like when we're trying to look for the correct metaphysical horizon by which to understand the world, we're looking for a description that unlocks things and opens things versus not. And this is why we have to deal with language. Like the question is, does positivity and negativity work as a description? It has some value, but maybe there's another description according to like a freak theory or an attraction or a repelling that's more accurate. Oh, maybe that unlocks things. Because literally after reading, say, McCarthy, you understand the world differently. McCarthy is very practical, but if you ask how he's practical, you can't say. It transcends that sort of categorization. Reading Faulkner changes your horizon. So does Flannery O'Connor, and yet it seems like they don't. They are useless, and yet in that uselessness, they are not. It's just a high order. It's beyond putting into language, right? So there's something here about description, and that philosophy is a training to get better and better at a description, like we see in Hegel, of something that occurred, because the better that description is, the more we are open to the unknown freedom, like that Dimitri was talking with Dylan about, that we can engage with that freedom in a manner that is different that came before, that we are so able to do because we are equipped with a different description. And so that's where the question is, what description? Because like when we're talking about like this philosophy is helpful for relationships, what are you doing? You're trying to describe what happened. This is how I interpreted it. This is how you interpreted it. This is what we were looking at. What are you often doing in a relational conversation? You're trying to describe something. Why are you trying? You're trying to describe how you felt. You're trying to describe what you thought. You're trying to describe why you thought. There's an argument to be made that language is always descriptive in a way, right? So it's like a novel. You're trying to write what occurred so that then when you're open to the future that's yet to happen, you have a different description. So then you can script the future differently, right? So you don't have that fight again, so that you have a different openness. So then the question, when we're asking, sometimes I think instead of asking is it true or false? Like there's clearly truth to Julie Rest, right? The question is, how can we engage in better and better and better and better descriptions, using what we get from Plato, using what we use from Hegel to get these better descriptions so that then we can have a different horizon as we go into the future. So there might be something to think about description here, because description matters. Description is not arbitrary. Metaphor is not mere decoration. We learn from Susan Sutt saying that if you describe cancer as a war, you think of cancer as a war and you become hopeless when you get cancer. So metaphors matter. It's like the camera in Susan Sontag as well. It frames everything. Oh, it's like a picture. It's a potential picture, right? So your descriptions, metaphor, change how you are toward the world, and that matters. And the better we get at description to understand what is transpiring, the more and more we'll be able to carry ourselves in the world differently. My final comment would be on this question of the relation of beauty and danger. We learned from Saint Cardinal Newman. There's this lovely notion in there that, and Dante as well, that God is also hell, in the sense that God is beauty for those who love him, and God is hell for those who hate them. There's also a long tradition that beauty hurts. Like beauty, like why is love so difficult? Like when you encounter and you fall in love, oh crap, I have to change my life now. Oh crap, this is devastating. There's something devastating about beauty, but there's also something transcendent. It doesn't fall into an equal category. But the interesting thing too, I think about this a lot, it's hard to think of anything in reality that under the right conditions can't be beautiful, but also can't be dangerous. It's almost as if that's a characteristic that every phenomenon has. If I take a cup and I put it in the right, like with the sun coming through with the sunset, it can be beautiful, but I can also use it to hit someone, right? Like a laptop, you can use it to watch a movie and have a transcendent experience of maybe the final season of Attack on Titan as it comes out in a few months and I'm not ready for it. Or you can use the laptop to like make people addicted or something, right? So it's almost as if all phenomenon under the right conditions have the potential to be either beautiful or dangerous, right? In the same way that everything could be negative or positive, or everything could have these different things. Well, if that's the case, and indeed the form of the death drive is also beauty, that would sort of align with how all phenomena seem possibly like within reality. Simultaneously, God can be both hell and heaven, right? So it would definitely seem that whatever the fundamental mystery is, with it is a thing that is both potentially beautiful, death, as in kind of this mysterious beauty, or it's potentially hell, ergo the death drive, in this way that Julie Rest has put it. It's the same X variable, capital X variable, the same Das Ding or something if we want, but based on our towardness, our conditioning, that transforms what it is to us. If we love God, then God is beautiful. If we hate God, then God is hell, right? Because basically what ends up happening for Dante and Cardinal Newman, if you hated God and then you encounter God, God is infinite. And so you infinitely experience something you hate, and that's hell, right? So the choices and the horizon that you are toward God with transforms if God is heaven or hell, right? So here is the question. Is it the case that our philosophical descriptions change what we are toward the Das Ding or capital X in a manner that then determines if it is more like an experience of beauty or if it is more of an experience of a self-effacement? If that is the case, if at the end of the day, there is either a fundamental beauty or a fundamental death drive, or death or effacement, if you grant me the language I like to use, that is the same X variable, and the experience of it is contingent upon our conditioning toward it relative to the descriptions by which we understand reality, then that would mean philosophy is in the business of determining if at the core of all things is beautiful or effacement. It will say if at the core of all things is a motivation towards something that is going to feel like a fundamental mystery that requires suffering, because beauty requires suffering, but is not just suffering. We have to go through both. The question is the order. It's the question of how we go through one to the other, and that seems to be contingent upon our conditioning, and that would seem to be the business that philosophy is in, but that is not captured in the categories of use or useless, is a certain sort of, I believe that is what will occur. I will do that work. I see how these things can condition my horizon differently or not. And that's what we're trying to do, because the description changes the horizon, that changes how that capital X variable unveils itself, unfolds itself to us. And so the question is, how can we get better descriptions? How can we engage in descriptions that are more so aligning it, so that the suffering and death drive that we go through, as opposed to try to avoid, because Julie Rest is correct, if we try to avoid that, it becomes a facing. But how do we do it in a manner that in that suffering we see beauty, and in that beauty we see a suffering that enables that beauty, so that the fire and rose are one and neither consumed, as Mr. Eliot would put it. But this has been a delight.